Hi Year 3, hope you're all doing well on this Monday. So last couple of lessons in history, we've started looking at the Roman Empire and we've looked at some of the important events and you've organised a timeline, and we've also looked at how the Roman Empire grew and developed as well, and you may have had a chance to have a look at a map as to how that grew over the years. So what we're going to be concentrating on today in our lesson is thinking about some of the reasons behind why the Roman Empire was so successful. Now, a lot of historians believe that one of the reasons why they were so successful was because of the strength of the Roman army. So that's where we're going to be putting our attention on today, and we're going to be thinking about the Roman soldiers, the army, how they were organised, the equipment that they had, the armour that they had, and so on. So we're going to share a PowerPoint together first of all, just to sort of talk us through some of the main points of that together today. And then there's a little activity in today's folder that we would like you to have a go at doing, and we will explain that to you when we get to the end of the PowerPoint. So Roman soldiers then is what we are looking at today. So this is the map that I was just talking to you about. So this shows how extensive, how wide the Roman Empire spread over and throughout the world. So we can see, hopefully you can recognise that map there from your geography work as well when you've been looking at that in your lessons. We've got the Roman Empire spread across much of Europe, Northern Africa. It was very extensive. Okay, they were a very powerful civilization that took control over many parts of the world. So how did they manage to do that then? Well, like I said before, historians believe that the army was one of the keys to this success. So in the beginning, the soldiers in the Roman army were the better off citizens who were sent home at the end of the war that they fought. So a citizen, that's a word that we use today. We use it when we think about a British citizen. So it's somebody that belongs and is part of Britain. In the same way, we have Roman citizens that were part of the Roman Empire. And in terms of the soldiers that were fighting at the time, the start of the growth of the empire, when a battle had been fought, and probably won by the Romans, then the soldier would go home at the end of that. The Romans actually copied the Greeks in terms of how they fought, okay, and the techniques that they used. So it says here, the Romans copied Greek armies and fought on foot with long spears. As the Romans, their empire grew more and more, they needed more people to join the army because their lands that they were in charge of had got so far and wide that they needed more and more people to be able to defend those lands and take care of them. So how the army changed, because it had to change over time as the empire grew. So one of the things that they had to consider was the fact that they needed to be fighting away further from home as they spread their empire and it grew further away from Rome. They had to travel further away. So being a soldier actually became a full-time job. So whereas at the start of the Roman Empire, soldiers would be able to go home at the end of each battle that they fought, that wasn't the case as the Roman Empire grew bigger. They would be a full-time position that they'd have to maintain. And that meant that because they were there full time and they were training full time, that the soldiers were very well trained and they became very strong, very powerful. So the way that it was organised, it's going to be a bit of a maths lesson for you now, and lots of different numbers to think about here. So it says the Roman soldiers were grouped into larger numbers that were called legions. So there were legions within the Roman army. And there were about 30 of these at different times. The number would have changed as the Roman army changed size, but about 30 at different times. Now, these legions were divided, so shared in between 10 cohorts of 480 men. So each cohort was have 480 men. And then these cohorts, the 480 men, were then divided into 6 centuries of about 80 men. and they would be led by a centurion. Now, normally when we think about the word century, we think about 100. But when we're thinking about it in Roman terms and within the army, a century would be made up of about 80 men. And then those centuries of the 80 men were then divided into 10 groups of 8 men. And these 8 men would be sharing a tent or a barrack room together wherever they were based or located at the time. So they would be quite a close-knit group of men, these 8 within that group. So a legionary then was somebody that fought within the army, okay, and was part of those legions. So the legions were made up of recommended Roman citizens. So that's that word that we've come across again. So they belonged to the Roman Empire, then they were a Roman citizen. The people within the army, they had to be 25, age 25 or over, and they had to be in the army for at least 20 years. So when they signed up, they had to be in the army for 20 years. The legionaries were not allowed to be married whilst they were in the army. And we talked about it being a full-time job, they were away and training. So being married wasn't really an option for them. They weren't allowed to do that. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you could still join the army, but you would join it as an auxiliary. And an auxiliary often had a special skill that the Roman army wanted. So it might be horse riding or archery. You can see with the bow and arrow there. And as a sort of reward at the end of their service, then the auxiliary would then become a Roman citizen, and they could legally become part of the Roman Empire. So the legionary's uniform, there's some pictures here of part of the uniform and some of the equipment that they would have had, okay? Now, as we said at the beginning, the Roman army and the way that they were organised and the way they were equipped has a big part to play in why they were so successful. So we're going to have a look at those individual parts today of the uniform and see why they were such an advantage to the Roman soldiers. Okay, so starting with the sandals, which wouldn't have been the most obvious one to start with, but hopefully once we've looked at this, you'll see why they were so important. So what was it made from? Well, they were made from leather, and at the bottom, you might be able just to see from the picture, there were metal studs on the bottom of the soles there, okay? How did it work? Well, we can see again from that picture that the straps were tied around the leg, so they were nice and secure, didn't fall off, because you wouldn't want that happening when you were marching along. And the studs that were on the bottom gripped onto the soft surfaces that they would be marching on. So what were the good points about these sandals? Why were they helpful to the Roman soldiers? Well, leather is soft, which is, as you know, very important. You want a comfortable pair of shoes, especially when you're walking for miles and miles. So the fact that they were soft meant they were comfortable for the soldiers, which was good. It's also a hard wearing material as well, so it lasts a long time. And like we were saying, they had to march for a long time, so they needed to have a material that wasn't going to wear away and wear out. So those studs that we talked about were great for the soldiers, because when they were marching on those soft surfaces like mud that they might have been on, that gave them the grip that they needed. So football players amongst you, when you've got your studs on the bottom of your football boots, you know that that gives you good grip when you're running on the football pitch. Same thing for the Roman soldiers as well. They would need to have that grip, so that was a good thing. They also stopped the soles from wearing out as well. It gave them that extra bit of protection so that they didn't wear thin. And you might not think it, but those sandals actually acted as a weapon for the soldiers as well, because those studs on the bottom were used to stamp on enemies once they fall into the ground, just as an extra form of attack, really. Okay, so not just in terms of wearing, but also used for a weapon as well. The disadvantages, though, as with many things in life, there are good things and then there are some bad things as well. The bad things about these sandals was that they weren't particularly warm, especially in countries that the Romans travelled to, like Britain. So if you think the weather at the moment in January in this country is quite cold, quite chilly, very wet, Sandals are not our choice of footwear at this time of year. We'd normally be wearing Wellington boots or, you know, something really warm and comfortable. Sandals would not be something that we would be putting on this time of year. The same for the soldiers. It wouldn't have been very comfortable for them wearing those sandals when they were marching through Britain at this time of the year. Not so bad in the summer, but not this time of the year. And although the studs were very good for soft ground, what they weren't very good on was when it came to wet, rocky surfaces. So sometimes when they were marching on those types of ground, then that would pose a problem for them because it would be very slippy. So some good things and some bad things. So the helmet. So this is perhaps a more obvious part of the uniform to look at. So what was it made from? It was made from iron, and it had brass decorations on the main helmet, the main part of it, and the cheek plates, which are the bits that come down at the side down here. Okay, so how it worked. So the outer rim protects the forehead, okay, so this part here, and prevents the sword blows from penetrating the helmet. So it stopped the sword from making an impact on the soldier. The rear of the helmet, so back down here as well, also had a guard as well, so to stop any sword blows being able to come to the back of the neck, which also could have been fatal for the soldier. So it was, you know, very, very protective of the head area. The advantages, what were the good things? So the helmets were beaten out of a single piece of metal and therefore gave greater protection. So if you had a helmet that was made up of lots of different parts, it would be easy to break. So when they're under attack, if they're being hit over their head, that's easy for that to break. But because it's one solid piece of metal, that is much harder for the sword to get through. So that was a good thing. It was made out of the one piece. They were cheap and easy to make. So again, we talked about how large the Roman army got. So the fact that they had to keep their soldiers equipped, the cost of the equipment was obviously something that they had to think about. So the fact that it was cheap was a good thing because they could keep affording to make those helmets to be able to give to their soldiers. And the officers were also able to show how important they were by the red horsehair. Now you can just see that on that picture there, just the decorative part of the helmet. And the direction of that horsehair told the other soldiers what rank that particular individual was. So a centurion, for example, their horsehair would go from side to side, okay, which I think is what's happening in that picture that we can see there. The disadvantages, though, as you can probably imagine, they were very heavy and therefore very uncomfortable. So they wouldn't be very comfortable to wear. But all those advantages that they've got there, okay, probably outweighed it a little bit because it's important to make sure they were protected. Shoulder plates then. So what were they made from? Well, they were made from soft iron on the inside and mild steel on the outside. So you can see the shoulder plates on the image there if you look carefully. This allowed the plates to become hardened against damage without becoming brittle. So brittle means that they're easy to break, and obviously they didn't want that to happen on the shoulder plates, so they're for protection, you don't want them to break. So the way that they made them that they were allowed to harden and give them that strength they needed. So they were made from curved hinged pieces of metal. And that meant that because they're curved, and if you can see it in the picture, they're sort of overlapping each other, that means that they're able to move their arms quite freely, but yet they're still protected. So that was how they worked for that movement that they had there. So that was an advantage, really. The fact that they were able to design them in that way meant that they had the protection of their shoulders, but they also were allowed to move them quite easily. The bad points, though, the disadvantages, were that the upper arms, so these sort of bits here are upper arms, and then our forearms down here, they were left unprotected. So yes, brilliant up here, but no protection down on these parts of our arm here. And much the same as the helmets, they were hot and they were heavy in battle as well. The shield. Now this is quite part of the Roman uniform, which is very noticeable and quite striking, the shield. And it's something that we're going to come back to look at, again, not just in history, but also in art as well over the next couple of weeks or so. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. The shields then were made from wood, generally made from wood, and they had additional layers added to create the curve that was in there. And the shields would be covered in leather and linen, and then they would be decorated elaborately. So you can see from the design on those shields in the picture there, they stood out, those designs. They were very striking. So how does it work? Well, it was semicircular, so it's got that curve to it there. So that meant that any objects that were thrown at the soldier would rebound to the other side. So if you imagine, if you've got a flat shield and something is thrown at you, it's just going to fall straight down in front of where you are. And if you're marching on ahead, then that's going to get in the way. It's going to be an obstacle to you. It's going to be a bit of a nuisance. But because it's curved, the Roman shield, when the object hit on to the shield, it would bounce off to the side of them, so it would be out of their way and they'd be allowed to continue to move. Okay. The Roman soldiers tended to use their shields in many, many different ways. But one of the ways was to create battle formations, and the battle formation you can see here is another one that an important one that the Romans used. And again, we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail as we go through the topic. So what were the advantages of these shields? We've already talked about one advantage of the curved shape of it, but also the hand grip on the inside that they were holding onto it with to make it nice and secure was protected on the outside by a metal boss. And you can see on the picture there, that metal part on the outside. So on the other side of the shield was their hand. So again, their hand is protected with that metal there. But that metal boss, as well as protecting their hands, it also was used as a weapon because that could be pushed into their enemy to knock them forward. The disadvantages, and again, this links in with what we just talked about with the shield, with the shoulder plates and the helmet, is that they were heavy, and especially when it was raining, because the material that the shields were made from absorbed and took in that water, and that made them even heavier than they would have been already, which is one of the downsides. So the body armour then. So the body armour, you can probably see from this gentleman here what he's wearing, the silver overlay that he's got there. So it was made up of multiples and many individual iron bands, and they were wrapped around the chest and the shoulders. So you can see what he's wearing there. The iron bands were attached together by leather internal strips, so they were all tied together. And additional curved metal strips were positioned on the shoulders to provide extra coverage. So we talked about the importance of those shoulders earlier on. So the good things were, again, it gave good protection and they had that movement that they needed. But also, because they were made up of individual strips as well, if one of them got broken, they could be replaced if they got damaged. And we talked again as well about the movement. And so the way that this body armour was designed allowed the soldiers to have that movement that they needed. Okay. The disadvantages, the bad points though, was that the soldiers needed help to put on this armour because it was so heavy. It was really difficult to get on. So they would need help to actually put that armour and get prepared for battle. So the tunic, now you can see there's a little arrow pointing on here to the tunic. So this is the red sort of underlay that the Roman soldiers wore. So the military tunic was made either from wool, cotton or linen, and it really depended on the climate of where the soldiers were. So they would change the material it was made from dependent upon whereabouts in the world that they were, whether it was a cold climate or whether it was a warmer climate. So it was a wide undergarment, and it was worn underneath the body armour, and it was really there to protect the body from the armour that they were wearing, because we've just said how uncomfortable and how heavy that armour was. So they needed something to protect themselves against all that armour that they were wearing. So that was the purpose really of the tunic that they wore. So they were made actually with a great deal of care. It wasn't just any old piece of material that they threw together. So they made them with great care, and they measured each individual soldier. And the length of the tunic also reflected the soldier's rank within the army. So like the helmet, they wore the helmet to show what rank they were in the army. The length of the tunic also gave the same information as well to the rest of the army. The downside was, though, that it didn't offer protection against hostile weather conditions. So when it was really cold and really wet, places like Britain that we just talked about before, then that would mean that they weren't really protected against the cold weather that we have here. Groin protection, very important. So this was protecting the private area of the soldier. This was done by placing leather strips which were decorated, and you can see in the diagram here where the arrow is pointing to those leather strips that are coming down and the decoration that's on there. Okay, so it said that the groin protection was a belt that was worn with the tunic that we just talked about. It was decorated with leather strips, and that provided the protection that they needed. The good thing about this is that it made a jangling noise when they were marching. And that noise that was made by, if you imagine, by those hundreds of soldiers that are marching together, was quite intimidating, quite worrying for their enemies, because that noise would indicate to them how many soldiers that there were about to approach them in battle. So it sent fear through their enemies, which was what the Romans wanted to do. The disadvantage, which is, considering what its purpose was, is quite a bad disadvantage really. It actually didn't provide that much protection to the groin area because of the design of it. So it was good in that it worried and scared the enemies, but not so good in its main purpose really of protecting the groin area. So that is a quick look at some of the Roman soldiers' armour and protection that they had. So your task today is going to be to have a look back at that PowerPoint in a little bit more detail and try and pick out those main bits of information that we've talked about together. So you can see on the board at the moment is the date and the WALT. So if you're doing this into a workbook, then you can pop that into there. For today's lesson, though, there are some sheets in the folder which we would like you to have a little look at. So the first sheet, which you can have a look at doing today, is actually a diagram of a Roman soldier, which you are going to label with all the different parts of the uniform that they had. Now, there's two options for this. There's one that you can label with your own writing, or there's another one where you can cut out the labels and you can stick them on. So you can choose whichever one that you would like to do there. Now, there's also two other sheets as well that you can look at today. So one of the sheets is a table, and on the table there are different columns, and the columns have got which part of the uniform you're going to focus on. So you might want to focus on the helmet, for example, to begin with. And then you need to talk, using the PowerPoint to help you, what it was made from, what the good things are, and what the bad points are. And you're going to use that PowerPoint to help you. Now, what we don't want you to do is just to write everything down straight off the PowerPoint. It's going to take you far too long. What we'd like you to do is have a look at that PowerPoint and just take off the main bits of information, and you can maybe list it down on that table there. So Roald Dahl and Jacqueline Wilson, that might be the better sheet for you to have a go at doing today when you complete the activity. Now, on the table, there are actually two sections, so that means that you could choose two parts of the uniform to talk about on your activity today. But if you wanted to and you've got time, you could print off another sheet and you could do as many parts of the uniform as you want to. There's also another sheet in there as well, and David Williams, this one might be one that you might want to have a look at doing, which is a diagram that you are going to, a spider diagram that you are going to complete. Again, thinking about each part of the uniform. So there's room on there for you to draw a picture of the part of the uniform, and then in the same way you're going to talk about what it's made from, and then you're going to talk about what the good points are and what the bad points are of it. So all those sheets are in the folder for you to choose, but it's really going back over the PowerPoint, having a look and seeing about the different parts of the uniform and looking and seeing how that actually helped the Roman army to be as successful as they were. So see how you get on with it. We are going to come back to this a little more in our English lesson later on in the week, where we're going to be talking more about the weapons that they had and also more about some of the techniques and strategies that the Romans used as well. So good luck with today's work. We hope it all goes well, and then we shall catch up with you later on in the week to develop this idea a little bit more. So have a good rest of the day. Take care, and we'll see you soon.